Greetings, brothers and sisters. My topic today is Beware of the Con Man with his con plan. 50 years ago, Bob Marley and the Wailers released the album Rastaman Vibration, and one of his signature songs was Crazy Bald Head, the bald head, referring to those in power who promote con plans designed to fool the people and keep them in colonial bondage. Little did Bob know that 50 years later, a new generation of conmen are now ruling the Caribbean. Take the recent headlines that the Caribbean community was planning to send humanitarian aid to Cuba. This was fresh after most Caribbean nations bowed to U.S. pressure and booted the Cuban doctors from their already deficient and inadequate public health systems. According to the Jamaica Observer in a March 1st headline, regional countries to send humanitarian aid to Cuba. According to them, despite Jamaica being threatened with retaliation after Prime Minister Dr. Andrew Holness urged Caribbean nationals to stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba. At the end of the CARICOM summit, new chairman and Prime Minister of St. Brat, Kitts and Nevis, Terence Drew, announced at a press conference on February 27, 2026, that the bloc's leaders had agreed to take concrete steps to provide humanitarian support to Cuba. Holness, in an opening speech to the summit, had pressed CARICOM member states to address the humanitarian crisis in Cuba with clarity and courage, and suggested that wise, skillful, and prudent management is needed to resolve the deepening geopolitical conflict between Washington and Havana. Yet less than 2 weeks later, the said same Holness government terminated the Cuban Medical Assistance Program. On March 5th, the Jamaican Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced its discontinuation after 50 years. Since 1996, about 277 Cuban medical professionals were affected. Cuba responded by withdrawing them and blames the termination on U.S. pressure. Similarly, on March 9, Guyana confirmed Cuba was withdrawing its brigade of over 200 doctors after the government moved to full direct salaries, bypassing payments to Havana. This followed Guyana in early February, quietly terminating its long-standing bilateral medical partnership with Cuba. Another 50 years of fruitful beneficial cooperation down the drain. The pattern is clear. Two of the founding members and major players within CARICOM, Jamaica and Guyana, with a 50-year history of medical assistance agreements with Cuba, effectively terminated their programs. But 1 week earlier, they, specifically Holness of Jamaica, were advocating humanitarian aid for Cuba. Something doesn't add up. If Jamaica and Guyana were really being humanitarian towards Cuba, why, within 2 weeks of the CARICOM summit, did they do everything that the Trump administration had been demanding from them for over a year? How can ending the most significant economic and social relationship they had with Cuba be mitigated by a promise of future humanitarian aid, will aid from CARICOM, if ever delivered, compensate for the increased sanctions and intensified trade embargo on Cuba by the U.S. government? Even weirder is that CARICOM wants us to believe that this plan for humanitarian aid had the backing of Marco Rubio. According to PM Terence Drew, in his post-summit press conference in CARICOM's meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, all parties recognize that there should be efforts to address the growing humanitarian crisis. This is the same Marco Rubio who is spearheading the Trump administration's campaign for regime change in Cuba. Prior to CARICOM summit on January 28, 2026, during his Senate Foreign Relations Committee testimony on Venezuela policy, Rubio explicitly stated the U.S. would love to see a change of government in Cuba, benefiting U.S. interests. He clarified that the existing embargo would not be lifted without regime change or significant political reforms in Havana. He went beyond prior administrations by tying sanctions directly to leadership transition rather than incremental steps. At the CARICOM summit, in a press conference on February 25, 2026, Rubio reiterated criticisms of Cuba's medical missions as basically human trafficking and a form of forced labor, where payments largely benefit the regime rather than workers. He noted U.S. efforts to provide alternatives to Caribbean nations and emphasized that Cuba needs to change by maintaining pressure on the regime. Given Rubio's single-minded desire for regime change in Cuba and his willingness to apply America's overwhelming military and economic pressure on not only Cuba, but also on the member nations of CARICOM, who maintain the program of medical assistance. Why would he support any attempt to address the growing humanitarian crisis in Cuba? In actual fact, there is clear evidence that at least two Caribbean leaders are supporting the American plan for regime change in Cuba. Chief amongst them is the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister, Kamla Persad-Bissessar. In her February 2026 speech at the Heads of CARICOM meeting, she stated, "I will not support a dictatorship in Cuba or anywhere else. We will not support it. What we do, we support regular, free, and fair democratic elections in a multi-party system. There must be the rule of law. There must be majority rule and minority rights. We must have the separation of powers and the checks and balances. We must have accountability and transparency." Also following the American line is Irfan Ali, the president of Guyana, who along with PM Kamla Persad-Bissessar was one of only two CARICOM invites to Donald Trump's Shield of the Americas summit in Florida on March 7. Asked by a Fox reporter about U.S. regime change in Cuba, Ali stated, "We agree that there must be an attempt to have the status quo changed. Those changes must lead to a society in which the rule of law, in which democracy, in which freedom is celebrated. So yes, a transition that involves these, and I think that is what the president is referring to." According to Dr. Wayne Kublasing in a column for the Trinidad Express newspaper, now that Cuba is in crisis, its distress aggravated by 60 years of sanctions, blockades, military threat and incursion, a recalcitrant minority of CARICOM judices are bad-mouthing it. As matters now stand, nearly 3 weeks after their grand announcement, there is still no sign or evidence of the content or plans for delivery of any aid package to Cuba by Caribbean governments. Even the Jamaica Gleaner newspaper in an editorial has expressed fear that the CARICOM governments are dithering and backtracking on their proposed aid. The editorial states the following: "For the Caribbean community, the verdict is near, and already the outcome doesn't look bright for the region. CARICOM may eventually dispatch humanitarian aid to Cuba, but history will remember that CARICOM dithered and prevaricated on the issue when the Cuban people faced dire straits. As it now stands, the 15-member community is being perceived as too afraid to act on a matter of principle and conscience, and as showing rank ingratitude to the Cuban people. And this is a matter that transcends ideology and geopolitics." Note that the Gleaner and other mainstream newspapers in the region are generally pro-establishment in outlook. For them to suggest that the public perceives the governments as afraid to act on a matter of principle and conscience tells us that the humanitarian aid announcement is beginning to look like a sham. In conclusion, this questionable plan by CARICOM to provide Cuba with humanitarian is once again showing the leaders as weak and useless. The Trump administration succeeded in bullying the governments of the region to deprive the Caribbean people of medical assistance by the Cubans, and have dragged at least two Caribbean governments into its plans for regime change. But in the long run, they have discredited the current crop of leaders as just another set of con men women who fail to stand up for their people. Such deceit and cowardice will have consequences. Bob Marley deserved the last word. He famously sang, "Don't let them fool you or try to arrange you." Thanks for listening to this podcast. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. Enough respect until we meet again.